Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Summer's here, and I'd like to celebrate by putting a spotlight on a dead and obscure series that is near and dear to me. When you ask most people which game they most associate with summer, most will tell you Super Mario Sunshine. And to be honest, I'd say that too. But after Mario Sunshine, I would say Boktai. To me, the Boktai series is the definition of a hidden gem, although this gem is admittedly a bit rough around the edges. What it may lack in polish, though, it more than makes up for in its unique hook. A story about a young boy who uses a solar gun to purge vampires. However, this isn't simply Castlevania with guns, although it is another corpse of an IP that Konami is just sitting on. Boktai is actually the brainchild of industry legend Hideo Kojima, and there are definitely some aspects of it in which its shared DNA with Metal Gear Solid shows. Now, those of you who have never heard of Boktai may at least be familiar with some related Easter eggs in more successful mainstream games. If you ever wondered who the dude on the posters in Lan Hikari's room in Mega Man Battle Network was, that would be our protagonist, Django. He's also summoned by some battle chips in select Battle Network titles, and even had some full-on crossover content within Battle Network, some of which is unbelievably unique and cool, such as a competitive battle mode in which players battle Shade Man in their respective game styles, buffing him in the opponent's battle by performing well in their own. Additionally, the signature Boktai solar gun also appeared as a weapon in Metal Gear Solid 4 and Metal Gear Acid, so odds are you've been exposed to some Boktai content even if you didn't know where it was from. But enough preamble. In this video, I want to take a look at the entire series from start to finish. This series gets basically no love on YouTube aside from gameplay walkthroughs, and I think that's a shame because it's awesome and deserves to be enjoyed by more people. There will be heavy plot spoilers in this retrospective, but I'm not going to outline each and every entry's story in excruciating detail because I'm not doing a full-on story breakdown. I just want to share a bit of what each game has to offer, in the hopes that it will maybe pique the interest of a few curious adventurers out there. I find the series as a whole interesting because it hits a great balance between maintaining old concepts and layering on fresh ones with each installment, from both a narrative and mechanical standpoint. Now, you can't talk about Boktai without first talking about its most infamous gimmick, the solar sensor. The original trilogy were Game Boy Advance games, and something amazing Boktai did was take the GBA's horribly dark screen and create a game that you needed to play in the sunlight, where the lack of a backlight didn't matter. But arguably more important than that pragmatic fix was its thematic link to the game's world. The world of Boktai was inspired in equal parts by vampire flicks and old spaghetti westerns, inspiration which you'll see in the game's aesthetics, character names, and definitely in its music. While he is a kid rather than a grizzled adult, Django's fundamental persona is that of an Old West gunslinger. He's a boy of few words whose weapon of choice is a firearm, but of course, not just any old firearm. Because Django is in the business of hunting vampires, his signature weapon is the Gun del Sol, a solar gun which fires concentrated bolts of sunlight to absolutely vaporize the undead where they stand. Naturally, the Gun del Sol is powered by sunlight, much like any solar-powered device, except it isn't powered by in-game sunlight. It's powered by real sunlight. For all three entries in the original trilogy, each cartridge the game came on possessed a solar sensor which could detect sunlight. But when I say sunlight, I mean sunlight. Ultraviolet radiation. You couldn't trick these things by putting them under a lamp. If you wanted to game the system, you'd need a blacklight, and I don't suggest holding your skin directly under a blacklight for any length of time. Now, between the fact that these are old out-of-print GBA games which never received ports of any kind, and the fact that the third entry never received an official localization, and the fact that needing actual sunlight to properly play these games is massively inconvenient, I would suggest curious players investigate alternate means of checking them out. The third title received an excellent fan translation ages ago, and all three main titles can be found with a solar control patch which emulates the real-world sunlight you would otherwise need. I think the series' central concession of requiring actual sunlight is a really cool artistic choice, and it's absolutely worth checking the series out on original hardware if you can, but it's important to know that more accessible options are readily available. And with that, let's move on to the first entry in the series. Boktai, The Sun is in Your Hand. While every entry in this series is an isometric adventure game of sorts, the first game bears the distinction of being a pure adventure game, without much in the way of RPG mechanics. While every entry going forward would go on to have an XP system, and thus effectively become action RPGs, Boktai The Sun is in Your Hand does not do this, and this single difference lends it an identity wholly unique within the series. To demonstrate what I mean by this, let's look at the fundamental difference between Resident Evil games in the survival horror genre versus ones in the action horror genre. Survival horror games like Resident Evil 1 and 7 de-incentivize combat and encourage you to avoid enemies by making them bullet sponges and not rewarding you with ammo for taking them down. By contrast, games like Resident Evil 4 and 8 incentivize combat by showering you with rewards, from money to ammunition, when you take down enemies. In essence, by adding in an XP system, Boktai 2, 3, and 4 are more akin to RE4 and 8, whereas Boktai 1 is the only entry to be more akin to RE1 and 7. In Boktai 1, Django's only weapon is the Gundel Soul, but that's not to say there's no variation to combat. The Gundel Soul is modular, consisting of a frame, lens, battery, and grenade. The frame controls the type of projectile it fires, the lens controls its element and power, the grenade is a limited quantity explosive that does not require sunlight, and the battery is effectively your fuel supply. Charging the Gundel Soul in sunlight fills the battery, and this juice becomes the gun's ammunition. Now, the battery is definitely the least interesting component, since there's really no strategy involved in selecting a battery. As the game goes on, Django will obtain bigger batteries. Bigger batteries can hold more energy. It's a no-brainer. You will always just equip the biggest battery. However, those other three components will be swapped out regularly. Frames in particular come in the widest variety, and you can get projectiles which range from classic video game pellets to large ring-shaped bullets, and notably the Gundel Soul's signature short-range spread shot. And while the gun is firing concentrated bursts of solar energy, the lens can channel it through different elements, such as fire, ice, and wind. This is used, as you would expect, mostly just for capitalizing on enemy weaknesses, although there are some environmental puzzles which make use of it as well. Grenades come in a few varieties, but are largely used for utility damage options, such as arcing over walls. As I mentioned previously, however, Boktai 1 de-incentivizes direct confrontation with opponents as much as possible. Django may require real-world sunlight to charge his solar gun, but he still needs access to the sunlight of his world in order to do so. In other words, even if you're playing the game on the beach in the real world, Django can't charge his gun at night, or even more critically, indoors. He needs to be outside when it's daytime and not overcast. If he's roaming a vampire's castle and wants to charge his gun, he either needs to find a balcony or a skylight from a window, and as you might expect, his foes don't have many of those lying around. To aid in his enemy-avoiding endeavors, however, Django has access to probably the series' most prominent piece of Metal Gear influence, a stealth system. While it's nowhere near as developed as the stealth mechanics of Metal Gear, Django can sidle up against any wall in the game and knock on it with his fist, creating a sound that will draw enemies to his current location. This can be used to get them out of your way physically, but also to lure them into skylights to have the sunlight itself take care of them for you, or even to get some enemies to violently smash into each other, which is always crazy satisfying. And while Django runs silently by default, many of the boss layers contain rooms with noisy metal floors which alert enemies to his presence not on his terms. So, players need to both utilize noise to their advantage and avoid making any inadvertently. Since Boktai isn't actually a survival horror game, enemies aren't very spongy. In fact, they're actually pretty fragile, so you can definitely afford to use some of the Gundel Soul's reserves to get yourself out of a pinch if you get cornered, but you definitely want to make sure you are conserving energy as you go. Additionally, most of the bosses are fought indoors and do not contain a skylight in their room, so you need to really make sure you're lining up your shots before you pull the trigger on them. There are expendable spare battery and energy charging items to help you out in these situations as well, but again, they're single use and thus shouldn't be leaned on too heavily. When it comes to the raw gameplay of Boktai 1, there isn't much more to talk about though. The adventure takes place in a series of interconnected dungeons with some optional zones to explore. Since this first entry isn't an RPG, Django's health is upgraded with special fruit you need to find, and his energy is upgraded, as I stated before, by finding bigger batteries for the Gundel Soul. It has action, stealth, exploration, and a dash of puzzle solving. All in all, Boktai 1 is a very pure, straightforward experience, and definitely the most gamey feeling in the series. But it does have one more hook, which I have yet to mention: the pile driver. You see, dungeons in Boktai are actually divided into two distinct segments: infiltration and exfiltration. The first phase, infiltration, is exactly what you'd expect. Django invades a boss's lair and squares off with them at the end. The end, that is, of the first phase. Because all of the bosses are immortals, beings which can regenerate themselves, destroying their physical bodies is only the first step to eradicating them. After Django defeats a boss, he seals its remains inside a coffin, which the player then needs to physically drag out of the dungeon and into the sunlight outdoors. Django is, of course, slower while lugging the coffin around, and he can't take it everywhere that he can get to on his own. This is actually a good thing, however, because it means you will often take a somewhat different route out of the dungeon than you took into it, and the coffin is cleverly used by the developers to both inconvenience you and open up extra puzzles which can't be solved without it as you navigate your way out. The coffin will also periodically begin to shake violently and knock Django over as the boss attempts to escape, and if you leave it alone for too long, it will begin to slowly drag itself back to the boss room. There are plenty of games out there about hunting vampires, but I have never seen this coffin dragging mechanic anywhere else, and I think that's such a shame, because it's a really unique mechanic that can only work in this sort of context. The exfiltration phase ends when you finally get the coffin outside, but not without one last trial. In order to fully purify an immortal, Django must summon what the game calls a magical machine by the name of the Pile Driver. If the Gun del Sol is a pea shooter, then the Pile Driver is a rocket launcher. This thing immolates the ever-loving fuck out of the undead, and I love it. While initial boss fights are traditional fare, where you take down the immortal's physical body, Pile Driver battles involve suppressing their ectoplasmic remains as they attempt to sabotage the machine and escape the coffin. This is another concept that I've never seen anywhere else to this day, and these fights are such a perfect capstone to each dungeon. The Pile Driver's strength, that is to say, how quickly it depletes the boss's life bar, is entirely proportional to the strength of the sunlight hitting the solar sensor. As a result, playing these games with solar control and the sunlight cranked up to maximum will generally render them quite easy, but I have some fond memories of emergent gameplay experiences from playing this on original hardware when I was younger. Specifically, I remember doing one of these segments on a partially overcast day where the sunlight kept getting periodically blocked by clouds, resulting in a frantic battle where the sun would randomly get blocked and the Pile Driver would cease its assault entirely for a few seconds, and I would scramble to drag the coffin back into the center of the arena every time this happened, because the second the machine shut off, the boss would slam the coffin's lid shut and attempt to crawl the hell out of there. Man, Boktai is crazy underrated. Anyway, the last thing I want to touch on for the original title is the story and characters. Boktai 1 has by far the simplest plot with the smallest cast. Aside from Django, who is largely mute, there are only a handful of other notable characters. Notable because they will return in other entries. The first is Otenko, the Messenger of the Sun. Otenko is a sort of sprite who looks like a talking sunflower with a big goofy cartoon nose. He is Django's guide and companion, as well as the traditional video game tag-along mouthpiece character, since Django himself doesn't have much to say. I like Otenko. He's simple and straightforward, but with a memorable design and a slight air of mystery. He implies that he embodies the sun's will and speaks on its behalf, sort of like a cosmic Lorax, but he can't really do much on his own, and throughout the series, he is occasionally used to punctuate a joke or slapstick moment. Next, we have Django's evilish twin brother, Sabata. In lore, Django is referred to as the Solar Boy, and Sabata is referred to as the Dark Boy. Although they are full-blooded brothers, they were separated at birth and raised by two very different factions. Django was raised by his father, a vampire hunter known as Red Ringo. The scarf he wears belonged to his dad. That's not really important, but the game tells you this, so I'm including it. Sabata, however, was raised by his aunt and her faction of immortals as a child, and was injected with what the game refers to as dark matter, corrupting his blood and allowing him to utilize a firearm called the Gun del Hell. As brooding and edgelordy as everything about this character may sound on the surface, however, Sabata is actually a great character, and will go on to receive perhaps the most character development in the entire series. Also, his parallels with Kingdom Hearts' Riku are kind of insane, but I'll go into that more later. In the original entry, he serves largely as an antagonist, and has probably my favorite boss fight in the game, consisting of a kind of cat-and-mouse dynamic, as he and Django pursue each other through a room full of small, claustrophobic passageways. Sabata can't see Django unless he's in his line of sight, so the fight makes liberal use of wall knocking to bait him out. In the battle's second phase, Sabata turns out the lights, which makes it even harder for the player to capitalize on his openings. Overall, it's just a very cool and satisfying encounter. Regardless of his role during the bulk of the narrative though, Sabata has a change of heart during the game's finale, and even helps Django defeat his evil aunt who raised him, the immortal Queen Hel. Hel herself isn't incredibly interesting, but her motivation is actually very cool, and similar to characters like Galactus and Thanos in the Marvel Universe, in that it deals with universal balance. Hel sees the chaotic, unbalanced fluctuation of the population of mortals and their competition for resources as they struggle to survive as being detrimental to the health of the planet, and perhaps someday the cosmos. She desires to reduce the world's population to nothing but the undead because the undead do not die or procreate, so their population remains stagnant and balanced. Obviously, being a brainless zombie is pointless, and life is about more than just existing, but hearing her discuss her philosophy before the finale definitely gave me some Metal Gear vibes. In fact, the Boktai games at large like to wax philosophical through their villains, so if you enjoy hammy Metal Gear villain speeches, you should probably find something to like here. Next we have the Sun Maiden Lita. Lita's a bit of a nothing character, but she recurs throughout the series as a supporting NPC, and is lightly implied to be a love interest for Django. This concludes the section on Lita. Lastly, we have the Count of Ground-Soaking Blood, or simply the Count for short. His full title is derived from his fighting style, which partially involves some earthbending shenanigans which happen to always be stained with blood. While the Count is also a pretty simple and straightforward villain, he bears the distinction of being a recurring boss in the series, the vampire who defeated Django's father, and also the most prototypical vampire that Django actually squares off with, because despite his title of vampire hunter, the series makes a distinction between proper vampires and a broader species of elite undead known as immortals, who I have already lightly hinted at in this video. Most of the bosses in this franchise are immortals, not actual vampires. The Count is actually one of only 2 such bosses in the original trilogy. And this actually segues us quite nicely into Boktai 2 Solar Boy Django. That is its full title, despite the fact that Django already bears this moniker in the original game, but I digress. As I mentioned earlier in the video, Boktai 2 introduced more overt RPG elements to the series, for better and for worse, but overall I think for better. With the introduction of XP, Boktai now had level-ups, and utilized a point allotment system where the player could control Django's build. You could allot points into HP, energy, strength, and agility. HP is self-explanatory, but the energy stat in this game effectively replaced the batteries from the original game. If you want to increase Django's energy capacity, you need to dump points into this stat. Strength is self-explanatory as well, but agility in this game actually encompasses both defense and physical speed, which is important because of another addition. Among the RPG elements introduced in Boktai 2, we now also have a full-on equipment system, with tons of loot to be both found in dungeons and purchased in shops. This equipment includes armor, which has a weight statistic that can affect Django's foot speed, and by extension, combat prowess. Upgrading the agility stat not only increases Django's base defense, but also helps counterbalance any speed reductions he may receive by wearing strong but heavy armor sets. However, armor is not the only thing that Django can equip now. He can also equip weapons. This leads into what is for me probably the most divisive aspect of this game. The Gundel Soul is very much Django's signature weapon, and one of the biggest things separating him from just about every other game hero, whether they're a vampire hunter or not. But Boktai 2 chose to separate Django from his signature firearm for the bulk of the adventure. And even once you finally recover it, it kind of sucks, in addition to no longer being modular like in the first game. It's weak, highly energy inefficient, and can only fire traditional video game pellets, no special bullets. Not even the signature spread shot. On the plus side, however, this separation from the Gundel Soul is actually worked into the narrative extremely well, and I will discuss how momentarily. First, however, I need to cover what replaced it. Boktai 2 features a more traditional RPG weapon system. Aside from the Gundel Soul, which is one of only 2 gun-type weapons in the game, Django can now wield his bare fists, swords, lances, and hammers, which behave as you might expect. Swords are short-range but swift, lances are long-range but narrow, and hammers hit hard but slowly. In addition to these combat differences, weapons can also be used to interact with certain environmental puzzles, such as using hammers to activate rusty switches, for example. Basic stuff, but it works. Boktai 2 also introduces a weapon quick-swapping system which resembles Metal Gear's. Like armor, weapons can be found in dungeons or purchased in shops, but they can also be forged and made stronger at the Solar Smith. Forged weapons have a durability mechanic, however, as do consumable items now, actually. While the original title featured what I'll call an Okami-sized inventory, where Django can fill his pockets with endless items and knickknacks, Boktai 2 introduced a limited inventory more akin to Paper Mario or a mystery dungeon game. Additionally, it added a mechanic wherein your consumable items, such as fruit that restore health or energy, can actually spoil and go bad. And wouldn't you know it, the speed at which they spoil is directly tied to the strength of the solar gauge. Boktai 1 had a mechanic where the Gundel Soul could overheat and become temporarily unusable, but Boktai 2 has a mechanic where Django can legit get heat stroke and full-on pass out if the solar gauge remains too high for an extended period of time. So if you're using solar control, you may actually want to take it easy on Django between that and his food items rotting in his pockets. It's not all bad though. Some items actually improve with exposure to sunlight, or at least change in some way. For example, chocolate candies will melt to reveal a surprise inside. It's a very cute touch. The most overtly sloppy bit of game design that XP leads to, however, is the game's continued encouragement of the stealth system. All of Boktai 1's admittedly limited stealth mechanics return, and puzzlingly, the game still actively encourages you to use them, even though avoiding combat in a game with XP is a terrible idea. In fact, I actually felt that enemy levels tended to spike a bit between dungeons, even though I was killing everything I came across, so definitely just ignore the tutorial's advice and disengage with the stealth unless you're desperate or something. Anyway, the last addition to Django's combat arsenal in Boktai 2 is a key item called the Soul Device, essentially a gauntlet that can channel magic and elemental properties onto melee weapons. It's effectively the narrative justification for the continued use of elemental attacks, despite Django not having access to the solar gun. Canonically, he's even stated to be slotting the gun's elemental lenses into the soul device when he changes elements. It's also worth noting that these new melee weapons work well in conjunction with the XP system incentivizing combat, because while you can power up attacks with elemental attributes, which drain Django's energy as the gun used to, you can also use these weapons without an enchantment, and thus at no energy expenditure. Outside of combat, however, Django was also taught a handful of utility spells for light use in exploration and puzzle solving. There's one for each of the 4 traditional elements, and they don't consume any energy to use, instead requiring that the solar gauge be filled a certain amount, with their potency generally increasing accordingly. The wind spell, for example, gives Django a momentary surge in running speed, and the distance he travels with it increases proportionally to the solar gauge. This is the single best of these spells and the one you'll probably use the most, but there are others as well. On a side note, the spells are taught to Django by a new character named Zazzy, aka the Sunflower Girl. I love Zazzy. She's easily my favorite supporting NPC in the whole series. Her design is adorable, she has this quirky as hell theme music, and I don't know what the hell accent the localization team were going for in her dialogue boxes, but I love it. I assume she must have had some sort of regional dialect in the original Japanese, because the fact that she has an accent is actually commented on by other characters in the game. Even outside of her accent, though, I think her dialogue is genuinely quite funny. I encourage anyone who plays this game to talk to her in town outside of story events, as that's where some of her best material is. This is really specific, and I have a weird sense of humor, so this line probably won't elicit the same reaction out of everyone, but I recall her mentioning something about getting cranky on account of her low blood pressure giving me a good laugh. I don't know, maybe I'm just weird. Getting back on track though, Boktai 2 has one final mechanical twist that I've been saving for last because it's easily my favorite, but I'll talk about it as it comes up in my discussion of the narrative. Now, while no game in the series ever reverts to a narrative as bare bones as the one in the original entry, I would say Boktai 2 has by far the most involved one overall, and it's for this and other reasons, which I'm about to get into, that it's a solid contender for my overall favorite entry in the series, even despite my gripes with the Gundel Soul. And speaking of, let's talk about that in more detail. Boktai 2 opens with a brief intro sequence in which Django is returning home to the city of San Miguel, the City of the Sun, after spending the first game in Istrakhan, the City of Death. During this prologue, Django still only has the now neutered Gundel Soul as his weapon, so enjoy it while it lasts. At the end of this sequence, Otenko has a little expository speech about how it's a shame that Django's father was killed by a vampire and only those of Django's bloodline can use the Gundel Soul. Then, a vampire in a hat and trench coat appears, promptly ambushes Django and snatches the Gundel Soul, and begins firing on him. The game doesn't confirm what you can easily surmise from this turn of events until hours later, but it's pretty obvious given how on the nose the timing of all this is. More immediately important to the plot, however, is the introduction of an immortal named Black Dane, who is the primary antagonist of Boktai 2. In the original game, we are led to believe that the final boss, Hell, is the queen of the Immortals, but in Boktai 2 we find out that the Immortals are split into many different factions or clans, and that Hell's title was entirely self-proclaimed, a piece of lore building that I really like. Dane, of course, has ambitions of his own, which involve resurrecting his fallen sisters, White Dunair, Red Durathror, and Blue Dvalin. The bosses of Boktai 2 are a huge step up over those of the original game, in my opinion, both as characters and as fights. The original game did have some actual characters with dialogue, but it also had these beast bosses with no personality, which just screamed of filler. The Count was fun, if easy, the cat and mouse with Sabata was engaging and memorable, and the finale with Hell was suitably epic, but Muspel and Garmer were filler incarnate, and the gimmick of the Carmilla fight made me want to fucking kill myself. Dane's sisters, by contrast, while they rarely have anything important to say, do have distinct personalities, great designs, cool transformations, and definitely feel like matching pieces of a more cohesive set than the members of Hell's clan. Dunair, for example, turns into a giant moth who spits a sticky powder on Django which slows him down so that her gross larva can latch onto him. In order to make her fly low enough to attack, you need to light up the large candelabra in the middle of the room, since, as a moth, she's drawn to the flame. You can do this quickly by poking it with a spear imbued with the flame element, but if you run out of energy, you can always run to the four corners of the room and knock the rusty switches with a hammer to light it up. Dvalin, by contrast, is a more straightforward fight, but the platform you fight her from is very small, with limited space to maneuver. It's surrounded by water, which allows her gigantic kraken form to attack you from all sides, as well as swim just out of reach of all your weapons but the spear, though you can attack her tentacles with whatever you want when she slams them against the floor. I'm going to talk about the other bosses as they come up, but overall, Boktai 2's boss encounters were all killer, no filler, which I really appreciated. However, there is a boss who exists outside of Dane's family, in a faction unto himself. The vampire who stole the Gundel soul and made use of it during the game's intro is the boss of the second dungeon, and is not only probably my favorite fight from a mechanical standpoint, but leads into one of my favorite sequences in the entire game. Surprising no one, it's ultimately revealed that this mysterious vampire is able to wield the Gundel soul despite it only being usable by Django's bloodline because he is Django's father, Red Ringo. Ringo was supposedly killed by the Count of Ground-Soaking Blood, but it turns out that the Count decided to have a little fun with him instead. Vampire Ringo isn't evil, however, he's just become mostly feral, and isn't in control of himself. During the second dungeon, Django finally reunites with Sabata after the events of the first game, who chastises Django for managing to lose the Gundel soul. Additionally, his Riku parallels are intensifying thanks to his openly antagonistic role in the first game, giving way to an extremely repentant but badass attitude in the second. Anyway, this is important because the fight with Ringo involves fending off his attacks while Sabata charges a mini black hole to hold him in place so that Django can slash him with some sun-charged sword swipes. Ringo will primarily target Django, but it's very easy for Sabata to get caught in the crossfire, so you need to pay attention to your positioning. Ringo alternates between firing on you with the stolen solar gun and rushing you to try and grab Django for a bite. He also has some of what I'm going to call sword kinesis, as he summons hovering swords to fling at you. He also uses them for the only attack he has which deliberately targets Sabata, which involves him summoning them one by one in a perimeter around Django's brother, forcing you to swat them away before they can thrust forward. It's just such a cool fight, and as much as I love the battle, it's afterwards that things really heat up. There's a divergence in the usual formula. Due to Ringo's status as his father, Django hesitates when the time comes to seal him in the coffin, which gives Ringo the opportunity to give him the old classic vampire bite and then make a getaway. This results in Sabata sealing Django in the coffin and attempting to purify him with the pile driver before the vampirization sets in. Sabata is such a freaking Riku in this game, I can't even. He handles like the classic, doesn't have as wide a variety of moves as the protagonist, but the abilities he does have are unique to him and incredibly potent thing going on. First of all, Sabata can't change equipment at all, but his locked equipment is great, and he has access to the Gundel Hell, which is basically a dark elemental version of the Gundel Soul. Additionally, while the Gundel Hell also isn't modular in this game, it still has 2 attack types. It can fire pellets, or it can be charged to fire the classic spread shot as Sabata spins around. Sabata also has a dodge move called the Zero Shift, which is basically a variation of Django's Speedy Wind Run, but he teleports behind you, because of course he does. All his moves and attacks drain his energy, but Sabata has one extremely overpowered difference in the way he operates. As you might expect, Sabata doesn't charge his energy in the sunlight like Django. In fact, sunlight actually hurts him unless he equips a consumable sunblock item. Sabata charges his weapon in quote-unquote darkness, but the game's classification of darkness from a mechanical standpoint is simply an absence of sunlight hitting the solar sensor. This means that not only can Sabata always charge his energy extremely easily, even on original hardware, but he can even do it indoors, without the need for so much as a skylight. So his energy charge is little more than a glorified reload function, and he effectively has infinite ammunition. Playing as him is such a power trip. But it gets even better. Although Sabata is ultimately able to purify Django in the pile driver, it sort of half works. Django still becomes a vampire physically, but he's able to retain his soul and his mind, so he remains an agent of good and attempts to find a cure on his own, as exposure to the pile driver took a massive toll on Sabata's body and leaves him bedridden for a while. First of all, the Kingdom Hearts parallels here slay me. I just find it interesting that despite Sora's status as the hero of light and Riku's status as the hero of darkness, Sora is the only one of the two who ever got turned into an actual Heartless, even if only briefly. In that same vein, in the world of Boktai, Django is the hero of light and Sabata is the hero of darkness, yet only Django ever actually gets turned into a full-on vampire. Just a neat little connection. There's some cool extra dialogue around this time as well, where Zazie theorizes that the reason Sabata wasn't able to properly purify Django in time was actually because he's the hero of light, and as such, his quote-unquote solar blood actually grants him less immunity to vampirization than Sabata's dark blood. This is similar to young Xehanort's speech in Dream Drop Distance about how Riku's prolonged exposure to darkness actually granted him immunity to dark possession, which is why the organization turns its attention to Sora for use as a vessel instead. But unlike Sora's brief stint as a puny Shadow Heartless, Django spends a good amount of time as a vampire, and it's a mixed but still very cool and novel experience. First of all, the vampire form, or Black Django as the game refers to it, is just flat out better with all the melee weapons. He swings them faster, but more importantly his attacks actually have knockback, which Human Django, or Red Django as the game refers to him, does not. Additionally, Black Django can enchant his weapons with the Dark element, which is used to destroy certain regenerating vine roadblocks and useful against the coming boss, but that's probably his most boring feature. Where Black Django really shines is with his unique vampire abilities, which he slowly receives some instruction on from his father throughout the dungeon we tackle as a vampire, and it's stated that Ringo managed to recover his mind and lucidity as a result of ingesting some of his son's solar blood, which I thought was a really cool touch. Black Django can turn into a mouse and bat, forms which are used for navigation and puzzle solving. The mouse can fit into small spaces and utter a squeak which acts like a wall knock, drawing enemies. The bat can fly silently and see in the dark, as well as hover over floor hazards. Black Django also has what the game calls a wolf transformation, but while he does howl when he uses it, what this really is the classic back-of-the-neck vampire bite. It only works when used on an enemy from behind, but each bite will restore Django's health. These transformations do take a small bit of energy to use, however, which leaves Django with a bit of a dilemma. Curiously, despite his vampiric exterior, Django is still the Solar Boy and still draws his energy from the sun, which is now lethal to him. Fortunately, there are a couple of workarounds for this though. Firstly, Black Django can employ the use of the same sunblock that Sabata can, but this is an expendable single-use item that only lasts about 30 seconds at a time, so it's not ideal. The other workaround is a little annoying in practice, but really cool conceptually. Black Django can recover his energy by sleeping in his own coffin. What this does is charge his energy very slowly, so it's not as quick and efficient as a solar charge, but will get the job done without exposing him to sunlight. You can even get different coffins in this game, including one which charges your energy faster at the cost of dealing less damage to bosses during pile driving, and one that deals more damage to bosses during pile driving, but at the cost of charging your energy even more slowly. While you can use this move for a few seconds at a time in the midst of battle if you'd like, you'll generally just save it for when there are no enemies around. Personally, I think they should have just made it so that it can't be used around enemies at all, but in exchange fills up your energy quickly when it can be used. Honestly, it's probably my biggest nitpick in the whole game. Black Django also has one hidden ability, which is a randomly activated revenge move. Sometimes when he gets hit, Django will spread his wings and do a screen-wide rushing attack that hits all enemies but cuts his current health in half. Honestly, this is pretty bad, as the damage it does to enemies isn't nearly enough to justify the massive health cost to you, but it looks cool and doesn't happen too often, so I'm fine with it. Anyway, the last thing I want to note about Black Django is that as a vampire, he does have some new weaknesses. Obviously, sunlight's a no-go, but he's actually weak to water. Not holy water, just all water. If it starts raining in-game, which tends to happen when you leave the solar sensor empty, he's pretty screwed, and one of the obstacles you're supposed to use the bat for, funnily enough, is just to fly over basic puddles on the ground. He's also more easily set on fire than Red Django, so beware of that too. Lastly, he can't eat human food, so your usual food items will only give him the stomach ache status ailment, which messes up your vision when you move. Functionally, this ends up being more of a fun attention-to-detail Easter egg than a mechanic, though, as Lita starts selling tomato juice at her store around this time, which serves as a substitute for blood with which you can recover health even as a vampire. The dungeon you explore immediately after becoming a vampire makes by far the heaviest use of Black Django's unique abilities, and is all around the most navigational puzzle-intensive one in the game. Right before you fight its boss, Red Durathror, Dane shows up to ambush Django, but Ringo keeps him at bay, allowing Django to go on. Durathror is a plant-themed boss, and while mechanically pretty straightforward, she loves just filling up the room with vines and projectiles, as well as coating herself in a closed flower bud while sprouting decoy flowers. The game doesn't spell this out for you, but the bat transformation can see which flower actually contains her, so between that, her weakness to the dark element, and the relative ease with which the wolf transformation can latch onto her, she makes surprisingly fun use of a good portion of the vampire's abilities. Once you manage to drag Durathror to the pile driver, Django finally recovers his human form through some friendship power bullshit, so he can actually utilize it to purify her. Fortunately, however, the vampire form is not lost entirely at this point. Rather, Django becomes a half-vampire and gains the ability to swap between his red and black Django forms at will. Very little of what remains of the game calls for deliberate use of Black Django for exploration and puzzle solving anymore, but once in a while you may still break it out for that. Personally, I still ended up using the vampire a lot for combat with basic enemies, since that knockback effect is extremely useful. And since Django continues to find himself exploring dungeons with limited access to sunlight, sleeping in the coffin to recover his energy remains a useful ability as well, however tedious it may be. Not to mention recovering health by feeding on enemies, I mean, come on. The final set piece that I want to highlight in Boktai 2's main story is the penultimate dungeon, though it's really the final full-length one, as the road to the final boss is more of a brief linear gauntlet. This dungeon takes the form of twin towers, which must be ascended by two individuals simultaneously in order to open up the gates in the opposing one. So to facilitate this, the game gives us control of Sabata one last time, and for considerably longer than our previous stint. Django and Sabata each pick a tower, and gameplay swaps between them until the boss is reached. I don't have much else specific to say about this, but it's such a treat, and I really enjoy it. At the top of the tower, we finally face off with Dane himself, but he fights by possessing Ringo's body, so mechanically, this fight is just a lightly remixed version of the Ringo one, though I don't mind this at all, since as I said before, it's my favorite fight in the game, mechanically speaking. Interestingly, Dane's master plan involved, among other things, using a solar-powered vampire to help him take over the world, referring to this hypothetical specimen as a dark sun. To this end, he tries to get Django to join him, but all he really does is ask, and Django flat out refuses him, naturally. I mean, you can actually say yes, which will result in an instant game over, but don't do that. Purifying Dane is a more dramatic affair than usual because it also inherently involves purifying Ringo, since Dane is inhabiting his body. After his defeat, Django finally recovers the solar gun, just in time to take on the game's final boss. Boktai 2's final boss introduces the concept of Eternals to the series lore. Whereas Immortals can live forever and regenerate after defeat, if not purified, Eternals are massive beasts that simply exist without end. Unlike Immortals, who are at least sentient, Eternals are entirely feral, so they're just mindless agents of destruction. The Eternal we face in Boktai 2 is Jormungandr, a massive serpent. The only thing mechanically noteworthy about the fight is that it's sort of a hybrid between a boss fight and a pile-driver fight, insofar as he's fought in direct sunlight and the coffin-dragging and pile-driving phase never happen. This concept is actually shared by the final bosses of all 3 original Trilogy Boktai games. In fact, Hell is actually fought in the pile-driver itself in Boktai 1, but I digress. If you haven't played Boktai 2 yet, just know that there are plenty of characters and little story twists that I didn't discuss here, so there's plenty of fun to be had and story beats to experience on your own. The overworld and dungeons of Boktai 2 are far more detailed and interesting to explore than Boktai 1's, and Boktai 2 bears the distinction of being the only entry in the series to contain a narrative post-game. Yes, for all you Battle Network aficionados, after defeating Jormungandr, you unlock an entire questline that would have been DLC had this game come out today. The evil NetNavi Shademan, the vampire-themed NetNavi, go figure, comes to Django's world and uses the power of dark matter to give himself physical form. Mega Man manages to pursue him here, somehow, but remains trapped in his PET because he's a good little boy who would never use icky dark powers. This questline culminates in a battle with Shademan, which actually makes use of both Red and Black Django's powers, and has a proper purification sequence as well. All in all, it's a wonderful little dessert and capstone to the experience. Oh, it also rewards you with the only other gun-type weapon in the game, the Mega Buster. Which is just as bad as the Gundel Soul, but oh well. It makes for a nice trophy, I guess. And with that, we are on to Boktai 3, Sabata's Counterattack. Boktai 3 is still Django's adventure, but it's kind of all about Sabata. The story really revolves around him. It opens with Sabata having what appears to be a nightmare about a new Eternal, Vannergand. We get to play as him and briefly face off with what is essentially a simplified version of the final boss, interestingly enough. Ultimately, Sabata finds that his dark powers are useless against another being of darkness, and this encounter is unfortunately real, not a nightmare. The immortal who orchestrated it reveals himself, and thus we are introduced to Boktai 3's main antagonist, Ratatosk the Puppeteer. Ratatosk's unique ability allows him to control anyone with enough dark matter in their body, like a puppet, and as such, Sabata finds himself in the role of unwilling antagonist for the rest of the game. This incredibly brief intro is unfortunately the only time we get to play as him this time around, so enjoy it while it lasts. After a little recap of all of Django and Sabata's most significant shared character moments from the previous 2 entries, we find our hero waking up dazed and disoriented in some sort of underground prison, and the tutorial begins. While Boktai 2 is probably my all-around favorite entry taken as a package, Boktai 3 definitely has my favorite moment-to-moment action in the original trilogy, as it combines the best of both worlds from Boktai 1 and 2. The Gundel Soul is back, and we have access to it for the entire game right from the get-go. While it is once again modular, it's been streamlined to only contain 2 components, though they're easily the most important 2. The gun's frame once again determines the type of shot it fires, and the lens determines the element. This is fine, it's all you need. There are frames which mimic some of the grenade-type weapons from Boktai 1, and the battery is an obsolete feature now that Boktai is an RPG, with the gun's energy drawing from Django's own upgradable stat. Lastly, because combat with the Gundel Soul is actually incentivized in Boktai 3, the developers took care to add many more opportunities to charge Django's energy this time around. Dungeons frequently alternate between indoor and outdoor spaces from room to room, and pretty much all boss fights have at least a skylight or 2 in them, if not taking place outdoors entirely. However, Boktai 3 also brings back melee weapons to allow for some short-range combat options that don't consume energy to use, which is always important. While only swords make a return officially, it's worth noting that they actually come in 3 flavors, although the game doesn't emphasize this verbally. While some swords utilize the same wide slashing motion which the swords of Boktai 2 did, others are rapiers with a stabbing motion which resembles the combat functionality of the spears from 2, and others still are heavy broadswords which use the slow smashing motion of hammers from Boktai 2. So, canonically and aesthetically, all melee weapons in Boktai 3 may be swords, but mechanically it sort of feels like all the melee weapons of Boktai 2 have returned. Though the rapiers obviously don't have the reach that spears did, exchanging that for speed of thrust. Finally, it's worth noting that the soul device from Boktai 2 is no longer present, so melee weapons can't be enchanted with elemental attributes anymore. If you want to deal elemental damage, you must use the Gun del Sol. Not that I'm complaining. Also, in a very nice attention to detail touch, the soul device isn't simply forgotten about, despite the fact that it's not in the game. If you talk to best girl Zazie in town, she'll complain about Django having broken the soul device she loaned him and demand he pay her back. It actually reminds me of Misty's thing with Ash having broken her bike, although Zazie does go a little easier on Django than Misty went on Ash. I guess her low blood pressure wasn't acting up that day. Anyway, at the end of the tutorial dungeon, Django and Otenko reach an impassable barrier sealing them inside, and we see a flashback as Django remembers how he got down here. In a very cool scene, Django was essentially ambushed by Ratatosk's entire clan of immortals at once, along with Sabata himself. This simultaneous gangbanging of the hero early on by all the bosses together is such a Metal Gear moment, and keep in mind this game released decades before Resident Evil 8. I also appreciate that Ratatosk is not ignorant of the events of the previous two games, and saw Django as enough of a threat to his plans to be worth taking out of the equation before he even got them underway. It definitely makes him feel like the smartest villain we've faced yet, in addition to probably the smarmiest. While it appears that Django is sealed inside the prison, he receives a stroke of good fortune from a tremor outside, which deactivates the seal and allows him to escape. Outside, we meet Boktai 3's most important newcomer, and also the single weirdest addition to the plot. It turns out the seal was broken when this foul-mouthed kid named Trinity landed on the tombstone it was attached to. Trinity's kind of a snot-nosed brat, and a consistent idiot who gets himself into pickles that Django has to get him out of throughout the adventure. His most interesting and bizarre feature, however, is his background, that is to say, what he's doing here. Trinity is from the future. The distant future. He landed on the tombstone when he was sent back in time. In Boktai 3, Trinity describes the future he came from, a world where the immortals took over the planet and permanently blocked out the sun with clouds of darkness, allowing them to roam the land freely during the day and offering humanity no recourse with which to purify them. This is actually really cool and will become important in the next game, but my issue with it comes from the final detail. Assuming he isn't lying, and being the straightforward idiot he is, I don't see why he would lie about this, Trinity tells Django that he was sent back in time as punishment for stealing a loaf of bread. This is fucking insane on so many levels. While I can appreciate the Jean Valjean-ness of his backstory, i.e. being over-punished for a minor infraction committed only in the name of survival, who in their right fucking mind would send their own enemy back in time for any reason, let alone such a petty one? The past affects the future, and not vice versa. Being in the past with knowledge of the future is akin to being in the plane behind the enemy plane in a dogfight. You're at a distinct advantage to affect the outcome of the conflict. There's a great Korean psychological horror film called The Call, where the entire hook is that the villain exists in the past and can torment the protagonist in the future, with her having no recourse or method to defend herself. And that's to say nothing of the idea that time travel technology in the future can be used so casually that a scenario like this is possible, yet Trinity is the only denizen of the future in this game. Nobody else ends up following him back, be they friend or foe. Overall, I happen to enjoy the narrative of Boktai 3, but this one detail is so mind-numbingly stupid and ill-thought-out that it drives me insane. Yes, I can admit that Trinity doesn't seem like much of a threat to anyone, but doing this to him is still needlessly risky for his enemies, and ultimately backfires on them spectacularly. Anyway, Trinity eventually elaborates on how the world of the future came to be as it was. The people of the future believe in a legendary hero who fought back against the Immortals, but before he could defeat Ratatosk, the Immortal who rules in Trinity's time through the use of Vannergen's power, the hero was betrayed by his friend, thus ending his adventures. The narrative at times tries to play a little coy with the identity of the legendary hero and his traitor friend, but like the revelation of Vampire Ringo's identity in Boktai 2, it's so unbelievably obvious that the legend is referring to Django and Sabata that it's painful. It could have at least been the tiniest bit ambiguous had the ruling immortal of the future era not been specifically name-dropped as Ratatosk himself, but that detail pretty much hard confirms that the legend is talking about Django, Sabata, and the events of this game. And spoiler alert, The events of this game are only able to play out and alter the events of the future for the better because of one Immortal's act of sheer, unbridled stupidity in casually sending Trinity to the past for basically no reason. By accidentally breaking the seal keeping him locked underground, Django has been freed to take down Ratatosk's Immortals one by one and save the world. I love Boktai 3, but the writing isn't exactly the tightest. Fortunately, though, there's still plenty about the adventure to enjoy, both mechanically and narratively. The reason for this is because you could take Trinity and the otherwise unbreakable seal out of the story entirely, and be left with a more straightforward narrative with perfectly real stakes that isn't being framed by one inane act of misused time travel, unraveling thousands of years of unopposed evil. If the seal on Django's prison could just be broken by defeating a boss on the inside, and Trinity was removed from the story entirely, everything else would play out exactly the same and be fully satisfying. So it's not like the story needs major reconstructive surgery to be good, just a little nip and tuck. Therefore, as much as I hate needing to do this, for anyone interested in giving Boktai 3 a shot, I suggest you simply ignore the implications of Trinity's trip to the past and enjoy events as they unfold throughout the game, because Django's release is the only instance of the future affecting the past anyway. Trinity talks about how shitty the future is a lot, it's kind of his thing, but he never does anything useful after the opening. Now, Boktai 3 reduced the town and overworld to a map screen connecting some rooms, but dungeon design and moment-to-moment gameplay remain classic Boktai fare, though with even more emphasis on action and even less emphasis on puzzles this time around. Django's coffin now transforms into a motorcycle called the Casket Bike for some reason. I guess the devs just thought the image of Django on a motorbike looked cool and contrived a way to integrate it into the game, but it works well enough. Instead of navigating to each dungeon through an interconnected overworld, as in the first two entries, Django now simply drives straight to them on the Casket Bike, in a brief but fast-paced driving minigame. For some reason, the skeleton enemies have them too, so that you have opponents on the track, but don't think about it too hard, it's all in good fun. You'll also probably notice that Django's sprite finally got an update in this game to more accurately reflect his appearance in the series' promotional art. Interestingly, Sabata got this upgrade in the second game, but it took them until the third entry to implement it for the protagonist. Regardless, Django has never looked better, and this bike ride brings us to the next major story beat I want to cover, that being the first post-tutorial dungeon. This comes to us in the form of a ghost town being inhabited and lorded over by the returning Count of Ground-Soaking Blood. In some more fun and actually well-done world-building, it turns out that the Count was actually a member of Ratatosk's clan all along, but joined forces with Hel in the original title simply because he was infatuated with her beauty. More importantly, however, the writers went out of their way to address the obvious potential plot hole of how the hell he could return after being purified in the first game, since purification's whole purpose is to prevent this. The answer is fun, and actually makes a lot of sense, I think. The Count isn't any ordinary vampire. He's the Vampire Lord, the strongest one in the world. As such, he not only has abnormally potent regenerative capabilities, even for his species, but as a vampire specifically, he has the ability to splinter off a fraction of himself in the form of a bat, and can regenerate completely from purification if even the tiniest piece of himself remains unscathed. In other words, every time a vampire hunter defeats him in physical combat, he splinters off a bat and sends it into hiding. The hunter then purifies 99% of his remains, but that one bat that got away regenerates him completely, sometimes within mere seconds. This is how he was able to survive purification at Django's hands in Boktai 1, and even continues to do so throughout Boktai 3, as it's through seeing him pull off this trick in 3 that we learn what he did in 1. During Django's infiltration of the Count's town, however, we are introduced to Boktai 3's newest contribution to combat, the Trance system. Trance is essentially a limit break mechanic. You slowly fill up a gauge over time, and when it's full, Django can transform into one of two super forms. The first one we unlock is actually Django's vampiric form from Boktai 2. Of course, in the context of the Trance system, it no longer has that fun variety of abilities from Boktai 2, instead opting to simply utilize two attack moves. Dark Claw is a circular area of effect rushing attack, and Dark Fang is a forceful blood-sucking bite that regenerates Django's health. Basically an enhanced version of the Wolf transformation from Boktai 2, in that it can be used from the front as well, and consumes no energy. Personally, I miss the more utilitarian use the vampire form had in Boktai 2, and to this day I'm still awaiting some sort of Zelda-like game to be made which expands on the ideas it presented. a Zelda clone where you play as a vampire, and the dungeon items are replaced with nifty vampire abilities. Come on, indie devs, make it happen! But having said all that, this trance mode interpretation of Black Django makes plenty of sense, and I can imagine many players enjoying it more. Just be careful not to enjoy it too much, for reasons I'll go into in a bit. It's also important to note that in a cool little narrative wrinkle, Otenko indicates that the reason Django survived the ambush by Ratatosk's clan at the start of the game was actually because his little bit of residual vampiric blood pulled him back from the brink of death with its regenerative capabilities. Django was practically a corpse when he was thrown into that prison, and is only still alive thanks to the very powers of darkness that he fights to destroy, something which the Count taunts him over right before their battle at the end of the dungeon. This is another oddly specific touch that just sort of stuck with me over the years, but the Count has this great recurring line that he likes saying before you fight him. He refers to the act of battle as the dance of death, and I think about this during boss fights in all sorts of games all the time. Between everything I just mentioned and some verbal implications later on that he has an agenda of his own despite working under Ratatosk's thumb in this entry, the Count actually sees quite a bit of development in this game and really shines as one of the more standout characters this time around because of it. Anyway, because of its somewhat more simple and straightforward narrative and even progression structure, Boktai 3 doesn't have as many interesting narrative beats and set pieces as Boktai 2, so I'm not going to spend as much time looking at those. But I want to re-emphasize that the moment-to-moment gameplay really is some of my favorite in the series, to the point that I revisit this entry more frequently than Boktai 2, despite ostensibly liking Boktai 2 a little more overall. And if you only play one game in the original trilogy, I think I would recommend you make it 3, honestly, simply because gameplay-wise, it's a lot like 2, but you have the solar gun. The immortal boss characters are also great this time around, and while they don't have as much connecting them visually as Dane and his sisters did, merely seeing them all standing together at the start of the game gives them a feeling of cohesion. Interestingly, Ratatosk's clan doesn't seem to be capable of large transformations the way Dane's was. Whereas Dane's sisters were elegant ladies who turned into large grotesque monsters in order to fight Django, what you see is largely what you get with Ratatosk's crew. The Count is the Count, of course, and even Ratatosk himself doesn't have a second form or anything. He just fights Django in his humanoid form. Hrazvelger's standing design is this ridiculous-looking joke character, but he doesn't actually transform for his boss battle. He simply spreads his wings, and his true appearance is revealed when doing so. Lastly, Nidhogger is basically a mechanist character archetype, so while his fight does involve facing off with a large monster, it's actually a mechanical construction of his, not the immortal himself, and the fight has a second phase inside the behemoth where you do attack his humanoid body. And yeah, mechanically, these fights are just as engaging as the ones in Boktai 2, if not more so. The Count, Sabata, and Ratatosk's fights are rather straightforward and vanilla, but still well designed. The Count gives Boktai 3 its prototypical vampire fight, complete with shooting out bats, which is always a must. It's still way too brisk and easy for my taste, especially since I like the character so much, but it does its job as the first boss fight in the game. Ratatosk is fought in Queen Hell's old throne room, which is a cool bit of fan service. He favors the use of a whip for close-range combat, and spends much of the fight hovering around the room, tossing out ricocheting chakrams and opening up portals from which various harmful objects spill out. He's also capable of summoning shadowy doppelgangers of Django and some generic enemies, but honestly, these shadows aren't particularly aggressive. The battle with Sabata calls back to his boss encounter in Boktai 1 with its cat and mouse motif, as Sabata is very evasive but can't see Django unless he's in his line of sight, limiting how relentless his assault can be. As in Boktai 1, you can capitalize on this using wall knocks to bait him out into positions favorable for you to pop a few shots off. But here in Boktai 3, the arena is less claustrophobic all around, and actually has a small clearing with a skylight for Django to charge his energy, allowing the player to fight more aggressively as well. Also, as straightforward as the Sabata boss battle may be compared to some others in this game, he's still got the rival with a similar fighting style thing going on. Whether it's Dante and Virgil, Bayonetta and Jean, Fox and Wolf, or Django and Sabata, the classic rival battle trope remains one of my favorite in gaming, and I think a favorite for many others as well. Hrazvelger's fight, on the other hand, has a unique mechanic where you need to protect Trinity and yourself from being blown into the thorny brambles surrounding the arena, while using the solar gun's earth element lens to grow viney platforms to stand on so your attacks can actually reach him, since he flies over Django's head and rains down death from above. Nidhogger's battle is pretty standout as well, having the two aforementioned phases. One in which you battle his giant mech from the outside by blasting it with cannons from a pirate ship, and one where you attack him directly inside the machine while dealing with this elaborate techno trap room. Very cool stuff. Before I move on to Boktai 3's finale though, I will quickly cover the only other major narrative beat I feel is necessary to mention, the acquisition of the Soul Django Trance form. At roughly the halfway point of the adventure, Django is forced into a rematch with the Count that he is ill-prepared for. Through some lore details that I won't go into, this ultimately leads to Django awakening to a new light-themed transformation achieved by merging with Otenko. Soul Django looks badass as all hell, but he functions pretty much identically to Black Django, even possessing the same two attacks, although his focused single-target attack restores his energy rather than his health. I really like both transformations, but I never end up using Black Django more than a couple times per playthrough, and stop entirely once Soul Django is obtained for one simple reason. Unfortunately, Boktai 3 has 4 endings, but they're not very diverse, and the way you get them is pretty dumb. There's basically an objectively best ending, which I assume is the canon one, an objectively worst ending, and 2 lesser of 2 evils middle-of-the-road endings. All endings are obtained after defeating the final boss, the Eternal Vannergand, and the only difference between them is who survives and who dies. In the worst ending, both Sabata and Otenko die in the battle. In the 2 middle endings, one survives but not the other, and in the best ending, they both survive. The issue is that there are only 2 factors which affect the ending: how you fight Vannergand and which of the 2 transforms you use more often. The Vannergand fight affects Sabata's survival, and your trance decisions affect Otenko's survival. As you may have guessed, you'll need to use Soul Django more times than you use Black Django in order to secure Otenko's survival. This ending stipulation is by far the more annoying of the 2, however, since it has nothing to do with the way events play out. It's completely arbitrary and incidental, and only serves to artificially discourage one of your combat options. The other factor which affects the ending, though, is the way you conduct yourself during the fight with Vannergand, which makes a lot more sense. Basically, due to Ratatosk's machinations, Sabata has merged with Vannergand and is inside a sort of cockpit within its chest. Vannergand has 4 points you can target in the battle: its 2 hands, its head, and Sabata's cockpit. The hands must be destroyed over and over to get Vannergand to lower its head, allowing you to do actual damage to it. However, while the head is out of reach, Sabata is perfectly within reach, and allows you to damage Vannergand without the hassle of destroying its regenerating hands over and over again. Taking the easy way out of the fight and attacking Sabata sets you on the path to some of the bad endings, either the one in which both he and Otenko die, if you used Black Django more, or the one where only he dies, if you used Soul Django more. The only thing that's annoying about this stipulation is that attacking Sabata even once accidentally locks you into one of his death endings. There's no threshold of damage dealt to him to be reached. One stray shot hitting him is all it takes to lock you out of the best ending, so be careful. And while the best ending is definitely the one you should be aiming for its feel-good vibes, Sabata does randomly get his own motorcycle during the finale of one of the endings where Otenko dies, which is pretty badass. And that's Boktai 3 in a nutshell. Again, while I didn't cover as much of the story as I did for 2, and there is somewhat less of it, the narrative is still more involved than Boktai 1's, and it's a fun romp well worth checking out in my opinion. It goes much more into depth about the history of Django and Sabata's mother, Mani, and the lunar tribe from which she hails, a narrative thread and bit of world building which was lightly touched on in Boktai 1, and I haven't even spoken about in this video. But this brings us at last to Boktai 4, known as Boktai DS in Japan and Lunar Knights in the West. While the title received some rebranding in the West, probably to distance itself from its low-selling prequels, there's no question of its place as the final entry in the series. Throughout this video, I've referred to the first 3 games as the original trilogy, but the truth is there is only one entry outside of that, and it's this one. While the first 3 games featured the same protagonist and core cast of characters, and took place more or less right after each other, Lunar Knights follows an entirely new cast and takes place in the distant future relative to those titles, and most likely in an alternate timeline entirely, which I will discuss momentarily. The game's Japanese title is one of those classic DS-era pun names. Yes, Boktai DS is a DS game, but it's actually short for Boktai, Django, and Sabata. The D is silent. These DS pun titles ran rampant back in the system's heyday. Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow, Advance Wars, Dual Strike, Resident Evil Deadly Silence, Shin Megami Tensei Devil Survivor, Dig Dug Digging Strike, Ninja Gaiden Dragon Sword, Guilty Gear Dust Strikers, the list goes on. However, this is an area where I think the localization distancing itself from the parent series actually works better than the original idea that the Japanese version went with. You see, Lunar Knights stars a pair of new protagonists, the Dark Swordsman Lucian and the Solar Gunslinger Aaron. In Boktai DS, these characters are named Django and Sabata, but they are very much not the original Django and Sabata, and don't have much in common with them, outside of a few surface-level visual similarities either. Yes, both Djangos wear goggles and have a red scarf, but that's all they have in common. Yes, both Sabatas have purple hair and a pasty complexion, but that's all they have in common. I prefer their localized names of Lucian and Aaron because they are distinct characters, truly unrelated to the heroes of the original trilogy, in terms of background, personality, and really everything. If this is supposed to be the future of the same world, then it would be a pretty dumb coincidence for them to just so happen to have the same names as two ancient heroes who they only vaguely resemble. This isn't a Link and Zelda reincarnation situation, after all. It admittedly is possible that Lunar Knights takes place in a wholly different world from the original trilogy, in which case the original names Django and Sabata would work organically enough, but I find them distinct enough from the original heroes of Light and Darkness that I feel having new names helps reinforce their distinct identities. Lunar Knights also lacks the spaghetti western theming and aesthetic of the original Boktai games, so the names Django and Sabata arguably don't fit in thematically anymore either. Now, as for the world it takes place in, this is where things get interesting, if a bit ambiguous. While it's never directly stated anywhere in-game, Lunar Knights appears to take place in the bad future described by Trinity in Boktai 3, specifically in that alternate timeline that he came from. In the world of Lunar Knights, the vampires have successfully taken over the world by permanently blocking out the sun, and capturing humans en masse to collar and install in these twisted sort of blood farms. There are still pockets of civilization fighting back, however, and they're mostly protected by a group called the Solar Guild, which consists of a ragtag team of rebels brandishing solar guns, not unlike the one Django used way back in the day. In a further wrinkle, while we never meet or even get to see this character, the deuteragonist Aaron's dead father was the rebel group's founder and leader, a man named Trinity, which would seem to imply that this is a timeline where Trinity wasn't sent back in time on a whim by the single most moronic vampire in the New World Order, and instead grew up in his era of origin, where he would eventually fall in battle with the vampires. Additionally, while these are essentially Easter egg treasure items rather than usable weapons, it is possible to find the original Gundel Sol and Gundel Hel in some ruins within the game world. Their in-game descriptions refer to them as broken-down antiques, but their presence would also seem to indicate this to be the future of the Boktai universe we know and love. However, I can't definitively say that this is indeed the bad timeline mentioned in Boktai 3 because of a few weird inconsistencies which would seem to point to it simply being an alternate universe entirely. The first of these are the specifics of how the vampires took over in the first place. In Boktai 3, Trinity specifically says that Ratatosk and Vannergand were responsible for the bad future he was born into, but neither of them are seen or even mentioned in Lunar Knights. Instead, the dark clouds blocking the sun are the result of a high-tech satellite known as the Parasol, which the vampires use to control the weather. Additionally, the world is lorded over not by Ratatosk or any of his immortal clan, but a brand new vampire clan under the jurisdiction of a twin-horned vampire named Duke Dumas, who actually looks like a younger version of the Count, if anything, though no overt connection between the two is ever stated, despite this one physical similarity of theirs. I can offer one explanation for this inconsistency that might place Lunar Knights in the original Boktai universe, but this is very much just a theory and headcanon of mine. It's really not touched on at all in-game. My theory is that perhaps Ratatosk is the one who ruined the future, but as was hinted at in the original trilogy, his clan of immortals was but one of many, all competing and vying for power, and eventually he was simply overthrown by Dumas's clan, sometime between Trinity's boyhood and manhood. There is, however, one other fairly large inconsistency that I can't account for, but I'll touch on that when we come to it in the narrative. In the meantime, let's take a quick look at both the returning and new elements of Lunar Knights' gameplay. On a foundational level, everything you would expect is intact. the perspective is isometric, and the RPG elements are back, complete with XP, equipment, and the limited perishable item inventory. You can actually make use of a shield now though, and the wall knock has been replaced with a whistle that is activated by blowing into the DS microphone. This is technically better than the wall knock because it can be done from anywhere, but stealth is emphasized less than ever now, which makes sense, because again, this is an action RPG with stat progression, so if you don't fight your enemies, you're going to have a very bad time with the bosses. Additionally, the DS carts that this game was printed on do not contain a solar sensor, so the use of the real-world sunlight mechanic is largely gone, replaced by an RNG-based in-game weather system. I say largely gone because it is technically possible to play Lunar Knights with a solar sensor by placing any of the GBA entries into the GBA game slot of your DS while playing, which does enable use of the solar sensor, but at this point I don't think anyone would want to bother. Curiously, a new variation of the speedy wind run from Boktai 2 and 3 is in Lunar Knights. Since the kind of magic that this move was derived from no longer exists in Lunar Knights though, it's activated simply by double tapping a direction on the control pad. It can be held for as long as you want, but drains your character's energy, so you still want to use it strategically. And speaking of your characters, let's talk about the new protagonists. Arguably, Lunar Knights' biggest new core mechanic is its character swapping system. After their introductory chapters in which they fly solo, Lucian and Aaron meet up and remain partnered for the rest of the game, barring one brief stint toward the end. They share the limited consumable item inventory, but they have their own equipment, skills, and stats, and need to be leveled up separately. They can be swapped out on the fly, and because they have their own health and energy reserves, you can keep playing even if one of them falls in battle, although obviously that's very inconvenient. Now let's take a closer look at them individually, starting with Aaron, because the way he operates is the most familiar at this point. As the solar gunslinger of the duo, Aaron specializes in projectile attacks. He more or less handles the way Django does in Boktai 3, but without access to any melee weapons. This also means he needs energy in order to attack. Additionally, while he effectively swaps between shot type and shot element as Django does in Boktai 3, the way the game frames this is a little different from swapping frames and lenses on the Gun del Sol. Now, elements work basically the same way in Lunar Knights that they always did in Boktai, but rather than equipping lenses to the solar gun, the player equips Terrennials, which are basically sentient little elemental spirits. Actually, they seem to be the same type of being that Otenko is, but representing the elements of fire, ice, wind, earth, and darkness, just as Otenko did for sunlight. Lucian and Aaron share all of the Terrennials aside from their signature ones, who I'll go into momentarily, but this distinction is important because it's the way the narrative justifies Lucian enchanting his attacks, since he only uses melee weapons and doesn't have the soul device. In order to switch shot types, however, Aaron actually swaps between different models of solar gun, which he obtains from fellow guild gunslingers as the story progresses. I really like this change. It's mechanically identical to Django's frame and lens swapping in Boktai 3, but it spices up the visuals a bit because Aaron has unique sprite work for each solar gun, and each Terrennial pops out and follows you around when equipped. Aaron begins the game with the Knight model, a handgun which fires the classic video game pellet shots. As a side note, Aaron's Knight is technically the solar gun that appears in Metal Gear Solid 4, not the Gun del Sol. He then obtains the Witch, which fires homing rockets, the Ninja, which is a set of rapid-firing dual pistols, the Dragoon, which is a flamethrower, and finally, Aaron's only optional weapon, the Bomber, which is basically a grenade launcher and fires the arcing grenades from Boktai 1 and a certain frame in Boktai 3. Lucian, on the other hand, only utilizes melee weapons, another factor that distinguishes him from Sabata. He begins the game with a sword called Vannergand, but can also obtain a spear called Jormungandr and a scythe called Hel. In other words, all his weapons are named for the final bosses of the original trilogy, which I think is a nice touch. Unlike Aaron, however, Lucian's 2 extra weapons are not given to you within the course of the story, so you need to go out of your way to explore and track them down, and they both reside deep in areas of dungeons that only become accessible after you defeat the bosses that reside there. While Vannergand and Jormungandr naturally mirror the sword and spear-type weapons of Boktai 2, Hel acts as a sort of twist on the hammer-type weapons despite being a scythe. It's the slow, strong weapon, and its initial swing is that downward smashing motion. Lunar Knights does add some new functionality to these weapons compared to their Boktai counterparts, though. The sword actually performs a combo, rather than simply being swiped in place over and over again. The spear can be charged to unleash a traveling charge attack, and the scythe can be charged for a multi-hit spin attack. While there aren't tons of variants of each weapon type as there were in Boktai 2 and 3, all weapons in the game can be upgraded substantially at a place called Sheridan's Manor, which gives the weapons you do have a satisfying progression as you play. Now, because these two level up separately from each other, you need to be diligent about keeping them both in shape. That isn't a problem in and of itself, but since Lucian is the only one of the two who can attack without expending energy, it becomes easy to over-rely on him if you're not careful. And there is one major sequence in which the two separate before the end of the game, one which I believe you're locked into when entering, so be careful not to send an underleveled Aaron into his doom. Anyway, the final distinguishing feature between the two is that only Aaron can use the solar element, and only Lucian can use the dark element. Aaron's signature terrennial, that of the light element, is Toasty. Toasty represents the only localization name change that I dislike. This is because Toasty is Otenko. He's clearly Otenko. He's admittedly drawn a little differently, what with the irises and pupils of his eyes filled in now, but look at him! He's a talking sunflower with a big nose. He's Otenko. Lucian's signature terrennial is a black cat with little red wings named Nero. Nero is named after a black cat in Boktai 2, who isn't even the same character, but for some reason, Otenko has been renamed to Toasty. Why? I mean, this is a silly nitpick, but I had to grouch about it for a moment. The Trance gauge from Boktai 3 returns, and Django's two transformations have been evenly distributed to each of the two new characters. Lucian's gauge will transform him into a vampire, and Aaron's gauge will transform him into Soul Aaron. Both of these are contextualized in lore as their signature terrennials merging with them. They also have a new property, however, as Soul Aaron will change the in-game daytime to morning when he reverts back, and Vampire Lucian will change the in-game time to midnight when he reverts back. Another situation where having a solar sensor wouldn't have made sense anymore. Additionally, while Aaron charges his energy in exactly the same manner that Django did, Lucian is a bit different, though closer than you may think. As the analog to Sabata, Lucian's element is darkness, but because he's playable for the whole game, they couldn't make him as ridiculously overpowered as his Japanese namesake. So instead of charging his energy in an absence of sunlight, he charges his energy under the moonlight, which has an in-game gauge to measure its intensity. I think this is the main reason the developers decided to drop the solar sensor for this entry. Lucian can't even make use of it. As a side note, Lucian shouts the word darkness when he charges his energy, which always makes me laugh because moonlight is just reflected sunlight, it's not darkness. Anyway, similar to Django and Aaron, Lucian must be bathed in his chosen light source in order to charge his energy, so he can only do it outdoors when it's not overcast, or indoors when under a skylight. Thus, he's essentially the nighttime variant of Django and Aaron, rather than a true Sabata type. One final thing I want to say about Lunar Knights as a game before I delve into the characters and narrative is just a comment on some of its more palpable atmospheric changes from Boktai. It's one of those things that adds to my feeling of being fine with the change in title from the Japanese version. The Boktai games have an Old West inspiration. It affects the setting, aesthetic, music, and overall atmosphere. The color palette in those games is much more muted and dusty. I'm not really sure if Lunar Knights had a general archetypal inspiration like Boktai did, but it has an appreciably different atmosphere between its brighter and more saturated color palette, its hybrid science fiction setting, and its wonderfully jazzy soundtrack. As a side note, I didn't talk about the music in the Boktai games earlier, but it's all fantastic, and while Lunar Knights' music is different in genre, it's no different in quality. Seriously, check out these OSTs sometime if you haven't already. Okay, on to the story. As with the Boktai games earlier in the video, I'm not going to go through the entire narrative in excruciating detail, just highlight some of the bigger beats that I want to talk about, so should you decide to go into the game yourself, there will still be plenty of characters, details, and smaller moments to discover and enjoy. Now, in an interesting twist on what you might expect, the game actually opens with Lucian's solo chapter, despite Aaron being the analog to Django. This sets the mood for Lunar Knights nicely, beginning with the broody anti-hero on a moonlit night, the time of day in which he's in his element. Lucian is the more experienced of the two protagonists, and he's also a total edgelord, arguably way more of one than Sabata ever was. I think if I was introduced to this character today, I'd have trouble taking him seriously, but because I first played this game at an age where I thought he was just unironically cool, nostalgia allows me to continue enjoying him in that manner. If nothing else though, he serves as a nice foil to Aaron narratively. Lucian also has a decent reason to act the way he does. He isn't just an obnoxious loner because shown shonen tropes, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Anyway, Lucian's story begins on the estate of an elite vampire called Margrave Reimer, who enjoys hunting humans on his grounds for sport. Lucian is a vampire hunter, but he's actually just here to obtain information on the whereabouts of the twin-horned vampire, Duke Dumas, the game's main antagonist. The fight with Reimer introduces us to the central narrative hook of the bosses in Lunar Knights. Similarly to the immortals of Boktai 2, the vampire lords in Lunar Knights are introduced in humanoid forms, but undergo a transformation of sorts into a larger entity for the battles themselves. However, rather than this being framed as an ability that they just organically have, as was the case with Dane's sisters, the vampires here are in possession of high-tech mech suits called casket armor. The game states that they originally donned these suits to protect them from sunlight before the parasol rendered that function borderline obsolete, but they're still powerful battle suits, so they continue to use them regardless. Reimer's casket armor resembles a centaur, and since he's equipped with the flame Tyrannial, he uses fire attacks as well. He probably has my favorite visual design of every boss in the game, aside from perhaps Dumas. The player receives a new Tyrannial for each of the first few bosses they defeat, and with them a new element to use in combat. Tyrannials also offer an alternative use for the Trance gauge, as activating it with one of them equipped will instead activate a touchscreen-fueled screen-clearing attack. But defeating Reimer also introduces us to the final twist to the gameplay formula that Lunar Knights introduces, one that I'm a little mixed on. This entry decided to remove the casket-dragging exfiltration phase from the Boktai formula, opting instead for something more action-oriented to finish off each boss. If nothing else, this is contextualized well. Since the vampires have blocked out the sun in this world, there's really no way to use Django's traditional pile driver, so instead, Lucian summons a rocket ship of his called the Casket Rocket, an obvious homage to the Casket Bike, to carry the coffin through the dark clouds and into space, where sunlight can actually be accessed. Where the hell he got this thing is never explained, but these are fun sequences, even if they're not as thematically appropriate as dragging the coffin, or conceptually and mechanically unique as the pile driver was. Whenever you defeat a boss in Lunar Knights, you will have to pilot the Casket Rocket through a space shooting stage that's controlled entirely with the touchscreen. However, the ship does not auto-fire. Enemy crafts must be tapped on to fire on, so basically the rocket cannot move and shoot at the same time, and this is where a lot of the challenge comes in. Each new Tyrannial you obtain also offers a new weapon for the ship to use, which is very cool and keeps these sequences fresh as the game goes on. Whenever one of these stages is completed, we are treated to a brief cutscene of this orbital satellite version of the pile driver called the Sunflower doing the thing that the pile driver used to. The thing that actually purifies the vampires, immolation by sunlight. Reimer's last words give Lucian the location of his true quarry, Dumas, and since Reimer was one of Dumas's elite lieutenants, his defeat grants Lucian partial control over the Parasol, which is a hugely significant turning point in the fight against the vampires, and also a new mechanic in Lunar Knights, which allows players to control the weather to some degree, even going so far as to alter the terrain in certain areas. New weather patterns for the Parasol are unlocked with each Tyrannial obtained. Even with Lucian having discovered the location of Dumas's stronghold though, he finds a gate sealed by the power of the Tyrannials in Dumas's possession, which prompts Lucian to seek out the rest of Dumas's lieutenants. And shortly after this happens, daybreak occurs for the first time in who knows how long. This is also why Aaron's intro chapter comes second. He's an apprentice solar gunslinger, but no one on the planet had received sunlight for generations. Frankly, I don't know how the more experienced guild members were charging their guns to begin with. Maybe they were using black lights. Anyway, Aaron's story opens with his usual training routine with the guild's current leaders, Ernest and Kay. He laments the fact that he hasn't been able to get his solar gun to fire since he inherited it from his father, Trinity, and shortly after this, their hideout comes under attack. Aaron makes his way outside after a brief stealth tutorial, which, again, you should ignore. Once outside, he sees a girl in trouble, and his overwhelming desire to save her awakens Toasty, who it turns out has been sleeping inside of his gun this whole time, clogging up the barrel, which is the reason it wouldn't fire. With his solar gun now working and the newfound power of the planet's returning sunlight, Aaron sets out to prove himself. On his first excursion into the undead-infested streets, he's ambushed by the Viscount and Viscountess Edgar and Virginia Poe, decked out in their own, no longer obsolete, casket armor. As they taunt him, they drop a cryptic remark about how it's necessary for the vampires to rule in order to protect the planet. Ernest and Kay show up to hold them off though, so the young gunslinger can escape, but are ultimately defeated and captured by the pair. This prompts Aaron to track down the pose and rescue his comrades, which is how he meets Lucian, who is tracking them for their Tyrannials. With the pair of heroes now together, the adventure truly begins. Their dynamic together is amusing as well. Aaron is wide-eyed and pure-hearted, while Lucian is jaded and cynical. Lucian doesn't take well to the young upstart's presence initially, just barely allowing him to tag along, but he does slowly warm up to Aaron over the course of their journey together, even if he never openly admits that he cares about him, at least not directly. He does indicate it through other words later in the game, though. The main hook of the fight with the pose is that they tag team Lucian and Aaron just as the heroes tag team them. It's a very cool idea for the debut boss fight of the tag team mechanic. With the pose defeated, the two get some info on the whereabouts of Aaron's comrades. It turns out they're being shipped to the laboratory of a vampire called Baron Stoker, to be experimented on, of course. Lucian and Aaron head to the train station where this is supposed to go down, and as they fight their way through it, Lucian is briefly taunted by Dumas. They reach the train just as it's leaving the station, and it's here where we're introduced to the second major inconsistency that leaves me unable to definitively place Lunar Knights in the same world as the original trilogy. Eagle-eared viewers may have noticed that when we got to Lunar Knights, I stopped referring to the villains as the Immortals and started referring to them as the Vampires. This is not a coincidence. Although the Boktai games made a distinction between the extremely varied spectrum of beings called Immortals and the specific vampiric subtype of Immortal, they were still grouped together under the umbrella of Immortals. They also shared one significant and noticeable physical characteristic regardless of which subspecies they were, that being blue skin. One other trait they all had in common, though, is that they were all denizens of the planet the games took place on. At least I assume so, as they never indicated otherwise. In Lunar Knights, however, the specifics of the distinction between Immortals and Vampires has changed significantly. While Dumas and his lieutenants are all specifically referred to as vampires and share the usual blue skin tone, once on the train we are introduced to Inspector Polidori, who acts as an emissary to the planet on behalf of a race he so casually calls the Immortals. Polidori is an immortal himself, but has a stereotypical extraterrestrial design and alien green skin, in addition to plainly indicating that he is a visitor on this planet, having come from the stars. This is the only inconsistency I have no vivid headcanon explanation for, and for anyone rolling with the theory that this is simply an alternate universe, this is probably your best evidence. In fact, another piece of evidence supporting that view is the little bit of surprise exposition we receive from Polidori in this scene, as he indicates that it was his people, these extraterrestrial immortals, who supplied the vampires with the technology for their casket armor, and more importantly, the parasol system. This, of course, completely flies in the face of the idea that Ratatosk and Vannergand were responsible for blocking out the sun. Regardless, our protagonists ultimately fight Stoker atop the train. Stoker's armor has kind of this giant enemy crab motif going on, but its use of one Light Claw and one Dark Claw makes me think it might be intended as a callback to the Vannergand fight in Boktai 3. The Light Claw clearly being powered by the encapsulated body of the captured Solar Gunslinger is a cool touch, though. With Stoker purified, Lucian and Aaron now have all the Tyrannials, and are therefore ready to storm Dumas' citadel, the Dark Castle August. There's another city full of monsters standing between them and the castle though, so it'll still be a while before they make it inside. Once inside, however, the pair are introduced to another of Dumas' underlings, though this one isn't a vampire. Peralt is a floating talking cat similar to Nero, and actually claims to be the Tyrannial of Darkness, even though we already have Nero. So how are there two Dark Tyrannials? This actually has to do with Lucian's melodramatic origin story. We learn at some point that he's not exactly a normal human. He used to be a man named Sartana, a solar gunslinger in the guild, and also the partner of Aaron's late father, Trinity. Sartana was himself defeated in the battle where Trinity died, a battle with Duke Dumas. He actually almost died in this battle as well, but managed to cling to life by siphoning off a portion of Peralt's power, which created Nero. So Nero is really only one half of the Tyrannial of Darkness, and Lucian is some sort of half-living, half-dead, but not quite undead shadow of his former self. Another interesting detail about Lucian that's never touched on verbally, but I've observed, is that while he wears an eye patch, he isn't actually missing an eye. When he transforms into his vampiric form, the eye patch comes off, and he clearly has two fully functioning eyes, which leads me to believe that somehow the dark power he stole is embedded in that eye, and the eye patch is acting more like a seal. Just a neat little detail. But yes, Lucian's quest is, as you probably could have guessed, a revenge story. His only remaining aim in life is to destroy Dumas, who took the life of his mentor Trinity and his implied lover, a girl called Ellen. After their encounter with Perrault, Lucian and Aaron are faced with what is essentially a repeat of the Twin Tower scenario in Boktai 2. The way forward to Dumas is sealed shut by a barrier for which the switches lie at the top of 2 towers which must be scaled simultaneously, prompting them to split up temporarily. I don't enjoy this sequence quite as much as the variant in Boktai 2 because there are no overpowered guest characters, but at this point in the game, not being able to switch characters at will is itself the novelty, and narratively this sequence is used well, as an opportunity for Aaron to prove to Lucian that he can make it on his own, and for Lucian to prove to the audience that he can trust Aaron to do something important without his help. The mini-bosses at the top of the towers aren't narratively noteworthy, but they're mechanically noteworthy insofar as they match their respective opponent's element, so neither can utilize an elemental advantage against them. Finally, the heroes arrive in Dumas's throne room, where a climactic battle soon ensues. Dumas is clearly very confident in his own strength, because unlike his subordinates, he doesn't even bother donning any casket armor when he fights you, although he does power up in a different way. Right before the fight begins, Dumas actually does a trance mode merge with Perrault, and it's this fusion of vampire and Tyrannial that you actually do battle with. The fight in general is great, easily one of my favorites in the entire game. The arena is open and spacious, his attacks and movements are quick and fun to dodge, and he likes charging up super attacks of various elements that you need to switch to the opposing element in order to counter before he can finish charging, meaning the fight makes use of all the Tyrannials. He's also the only boss to use any prototypical vampire-like moves, such as turning into a swarm of bats. Overall, a very cool and enjoyable fight. After the battle, we receive some exposition elaborating on what the Poe siblings had hinted at earlier. It turns out that the vampires had, in their own twisted way, been protecting the planet itself from the Immortals, who saw the human population as a virus and wanted to totally extinguish all life on the planet and add it to their collective. The Immortals allowed the vampires to take charge in an attempt to corral the humans and cull the herd a bit, thereby demonstrating that the human population could be controlled and the planet didn't have to be completely decimated. After witnessing Dumas's defeat, Polidori decides that if even the vampires cannot contain humanity, then the Immortals will have to go with their original plan, and transforms the Parasol into a Death Star-like entity called the Planet Eater Byron. He also vaguely insinuates that he intends to create copies of the vampires' bodies for his own people to inhabit, which would imply that the Immortals' natural bodies are weaker than those of the vampires, but he doesn't elaborate on this and we never got a sequel, so who can say. Regardless, the final gauntlet which Lucian and Aaron must clear is the infiltration of the Planet Eater, which has some nice "I'll hold them off while you go on ahead" moments, as various members of the Solar Guild show up to provide some backup. The final battle with Polidori is a fun 2-part spectacle as well. It begins with him merging with the Planet Eater's core, and takes place in a massive pool of blood. Polidori summons copies of the previous vampire bosses to attack the duo, alongside some original attacks of his own. Once this form is defeated, he assumes a new one and begins fleeing into space, prompting Lucian and Aaron to give chase in the casket rocket for one last space shooting segment. Once this is finished, the game is over as well, and we get a pleasant, if brief and predictable, resolution. I feel like my discussion of the finale was a bit sudden and rushed, and to be honest, that's kind of how the ending feels to me. Nothing about it is terrible, mind you, and the game is a perfectly fair length, but while Lunar Knights does wrap up its own story, it leaves so much room for world building and one major unresolved thread with the Immortals at large, which leads me to believe they were leaving the door open for a sequel. I loved the world building and characters in this title, so obviously I'm still sad that we never got that sequel, but overall I'm very pleased with what we did get. A fun, fresh, replayable capstone to the Boktai franchise. And as an added bit of fan service, Lunar Knights actually had some crossover content with Mega Man Star Force, perfectly mirroring Boktai's crossover content with Battle Network, since Lunar Knights and Star Force are both distant future sequels to those respective series. Originally, I wanted to discuss the crossover content a bit more in depth, but a lot of it is Japanese exclusive, and this script is already so very long. But yeah, all I really set out to do here was give a little love to Konami's forgotten, more summer seasonal vampire hunting series, because nobody ever talks about these games anymore, and yet they live on so strongly in both my memory and my replay queue. For any longtime fans out there, I hope you had a nice little stroll down memory lane, and for any newcomers, I hope I've enticed you to at least give them a try. They're definitely a little simple, clunky, and rough around the edges in more than a few areas, but each entry manages to have an extremely distinct identity despite their core gameplay similarities, and really there's nothing else out there quite like them. Boktai is yet another of those franchises where I feel the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. There's just something about the way the music, art style, and atmosphere coalesce to create something incredibly nostalgic. It's funny, Boktai isn't about childhood specifically, and yet for me it somehow captures that essence. Part of that is nostalgia, as it takes me back to the more carefree days I spent with it, but part of it is something else, something I can't quite quantify or put into words. And in speaking of the series' legacy, I want to give a little shout out to an extremely ambitious fan project that I discovered while working on this video, which made me grin from ear to ear. It seems like one magnificently dedicated fan has been and still is in active development of an unofficial Boktai 5 title called Kura 5 Bonds of the Undying. Kura 5 is the perfect marriage of Boktai and Lunar Knights, taking place in the more developed Boktai universe, but starring a pair of protagonists, another solar gunslinger and dark swordsman. The dark hero this time around, however, is a full-blooded vampire with a more playful personality, who even possesses the utilitarian shape-shifting abilities of Black Django, which makes me stupidly happy. The developer clearly has not only a love for the franchise's gameplay, but also its characters and world building. The game even adds a nighttime variant of purification called Assimilation, contextualized by the vampire essentially devouring the remains of an immortal, rather than the solar child vaporizing them. This perfectly bridges the gap between artistic integrity and player accessibility, and I love it. Perhaps this game's most significant contribution, however, is their answer to the Solar Sensor, which is an in-game program that reads your own local time and weather data to determine whether it's day or night in-game, whether or not it's raining, and how strong the sun or moonlight is. I always wondered how this series could be transitioned onto consoles in the modern day without compromising on its original artistic vision, but this answer is so simple yet elegant it almost seems obvious in hindsight. It's the perfect way to bring the original trilogy's augmented reality weather mechanics into the age of the internet. It's just perfection. Please check this project out and support the developer if you're a longtime fan. And if the person working on it ever sees this video, please keep going until you're finished. I would absolutely pay money to play a completed product, even if you have to rebrand it and separate it from the original Boktai universe, a la Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. In the meantime, I highly doubt we'll ever see this series return in any official capacity for an endless multitude of reasons, but who's to say for sure? Even if the sun has set on Boktai for now, where there's life, there's always hope. And as Master Otenko is so very fond of saying, no matter how dark things get, the sun will rise tomorrow.